I'm delighted to see a relatively full house and no reason for us to delay getting into the substance of the matter. I'm Adam Posen. I'm president of the Peterson Institute for International Economics, and I am thrilled on many levels to welcome you to today's event on the economics of Abenomics, a pre-summit assessment. We're delighted today to be partnering with the Sasakawa Peace Foundation USA, whose president will be following me to give another welcome and a more detailed one at that. As many of the people in this room share, I and several members of the research staff here at the Institute cut our teeth and spent a lot of time and hours working on Japanese economics and US-Japan relations through the 90s, through the 80s, through the 90s into the 2000s. And the last few years have been relatively quiescent on both fronts. Some would say deservedly, some would say undeservedly, but there is no question that there is a new wind blowing right now in Japan. I was not partisan before the election. I don't pretend to be partisan ahead of the upper house election, but I will say that in terms of economic agenda, energy, and commitment, I at least am very optimistic on what Prime Minister Abe and this government are going forward to do. And so to be able to have an event here at the Institute with so many friends who, not just Sasakawa Peace Foundation, but starting with them, with whom we've worked for the years, when there is so much of economic substance to be discussed on Japan, is really an exciting thing to be doing. In substance, many of you are here knowing who we're having, but just let me recap and say we are very fortunate to have with us two of the leading Japanese economists, academics, and frankly advisors directly to the Abe government, to the Prime Minister and beyond. One, of course, is Koichi Hamada from Yale, who at present, I think you have what, either the #1 or #2 best-selling nonfiction book in Japan? Except for the diet books, of course. I was going to get a picture to put up, but not. And I think that many of us are old friends with Koichi and know his extensive, important work in international economics, but not everybody always realizes that he played a role in the cabinet office in the Koizumi and Takanaka team a decade ago, and continues to be at the forefront of economic policy debate in Japan. And so we're just delighted to have him here with us today. Similarly, we are honored and delighted to have Motsushige Ito from Todai, from the University of Tokyo, who worked with the Sasakawa Foundation. We're very grateful to them and him for making the effort to come over here. He is going to be speaking on leading off our second panel on TPP and its role for structural reform in Japan, and he too is someone who Washington needs to hear and be aware of as incredibly influential in Japan, and in my opinion, in a very constructive way. And so we're just very grateful to have Professor Ito with us. Also speaking today, we'll go through the details, Stephan Danninger from the IMF, who's been doing great work for several years on the Japan desk and is at the forefront. My colleague Jeff Schott, who many of you know, just wrote with co-authors Julia Muir and Barbara Kochwar, a superb book on the Trans-Pacific Partnership, and he did not directly address Japan as much in that, and so he's going to talk about that. And also joining us, thanks to the good efforts of the Sasakawa Peace Foundation USA, former USTR Clayton Yeiter will be joining us in the second panel. Just a couple formatting things. This meeting is obviously completely on the record. We want it to be on the record. And in fact, we have gone so far that this is the first ever event that the Institute is streaming live over the internet. I'm grateful to Helen Hillebrand, Ed Tureen, and our publications and technical staff who made that happen. And I have sent emails to people in Tokyo letting them know that if they can stay awake, they are welcome to join. We're not quite yet ready to be taking questions live from abroad, but we'll get there. And it's just another sign of the continuing evolution of the Institute's outreach. Of course, like all Institute events, the video, the audio, and eventually transcripts will be up on the website, www.PIIE.com. So we're going to run until 12:30. Untraditionally for the Institute, perhaps, we are not offering to feed you lunch. We got a crowd without doing this, so we violated Fred's first rule, which is bribe them with food. There will be a coffee break in between the two panels, but we are going to try to break this up so that there will be audience participation after each set of speakers, both for anybody here to raise a point, make a question, engage with our distinguished panelists. So without wanting to delay things any further, let me call on Junko Chano, who is the Executive Director of the Sasakawa Peace Foundation USA, who's our partner in this event. Ms. Chano.
Thank you, Dr. Posen, for your kind introduction. And good morning and welcome. My name is Junko Chano, and a slight correction that I'm the Executive Director of the Sasakawa Peace Foundation based in Japan, and also the President of Sasakawa Peace Foundation USA. They are different entities, and it is complicated, so it's very easy to... No, that's quite all right. So again, welcome to the conference, and I feel very much honored to open this conference on Abenomics that we organized together with the Peterson Institute of International Economics. And I'd like to express my sincere appreciation to Dr. Posen and other professional staff members at the Peterson Institute for working with us to organize this timely conference. Talking about Abenomics, it seems to me that it comes with many surprises. To name a few, I think it is the first time that a Prime Minister's name is used to symbolize his economic policies, and has become well recognized in Japan and elsewhere. And secondly, thanks largely to his economic policies, Mr. Abe's approval rate has gone up to 60 to 65%, even after his administration is up and running. And that was not the case in a series of previous administrations. And also nobody in Japan, perhaps, even thought Mr. Abe would make a comeback after his resignation from the Prime Minister's seat 5 years ago, due to his health problem and perhaps other compounded reasons. In his recent remarks, Mr. Abe admitted that he made mistakes in his first administration, partly being too abrupt to make many changes. He even thought about retirement, but he pulled through amidst criticisms and disappointments. He now strongly feels that he is indebted to the country and is determined to work to rebuild the nation. And it somehow resonates our feelings that we must have made mistakes, but we are ready to strive for the better future. And Abenomics seems to be working so far. Japanese stock market recorded highest after Lehman shock. Japanese yen, that had been overly appreciated, now is coming to a reasonable range. And Mr. Abe's message that people who work hard should be properly rewarded, that strongly appeals to the Japanese public. So far, so good. But Abenomics is just a month-old baby, so much remains to be seen. And therefore, we have invited to the conference 2 key players in helping Mr. Abe to move forward with his economic policies. And Dr. Posen explained quite well about Dr. Hamada and Dr. Ito, but if I echo a little bit, Dr. Koichi Hamada, he's a professor emeritus of Yale University, and he currently works as special advisor to the cabinet. And I understand that Mr. Abe really respects him and also trusts on his advice. And Dr. Motoshige Ito of Tokyo University, he's a leading member of the Council on Economic and Fiscal Policy right now, and is quite responsible for fiscal stimulus of Abe's policy. And speakers from the United States, also we have Dr. Geringer from IMF, and also Dr. Posen and Dr. Mark Noland. They are specialists on Japanese economy. And also Dr. Schott and also Ambassador Clayton Yaiter. They are quite knowledgeable about trade policies. So I'd like to thank all the speakers today for kindly coming and to speak at the conference. And finally, I'd like to thank all the participants today, and I hope we enjoy the discussions. Thank you very much.
Good morning. My name is Marcus Noland. I'm Director of Studies here at the Peterson Institute. It is my pleasure to chair the first panel dealing with macroeconomic issues. We have a wonderful panel of speakers. Our first speaker will be Professor Koichi Hamada. Koichi is the Tuntex Professor of Economics at Yale University, where he specializes in the Japanese economy and international economics, and is Professor Emeritus at Tokyo University, where he taught before coming to Yale in 1986. He is a Fellow of the Econometric Society, which for people like me is a big deal. He was the President of the Japan Economic Association and was the founding President of the Japan Law and Economics Association. In Japan, he has participated in many policy committees and advisory boards, but perhaps most significantly from January 2001 to July 2002, Koichi took leave from Yale to serve as the first president of the Economic and Social Research Institute in the Cabinet Office, a body created to promote administrative reform chaired by the Prime Minister. For these good works, he has been awarded the Imperial Decoration, the Order of the Sacred Treasure, Gold and Silver Star, which is given to those who have accumulated distinguished achievements for Japan. Our second speaker will be Adam Posen, the president of the Peterson Institute for International Economics. He recently returned from the UK, where he spent 3 years as an external member of the Bank of England's Monetary Policy Committee. Adam has published numerous pieces on the Japanese economy, beginning with his 1998 book, Restoring Japan's Economic Growth. He is still trying. Last but not least, and by way of comparison, the new kid on the block, Stephan Danninger is division chief in the IMF's Asia and Pacific Department and has covered Japan for the last 4 years. He has been at the fund since 2000, where his research has covered a variety of topics, including the determinants of fiscal sustainability, the effectiveness of fiscal rules, determinants of export competitiveness, and cross-country spillovers from global financial distress, all of which will be key issues in our discussions today. So without further ado, I'd like to turn it over to Koichi, and I would ask the 3 speakers to try to keep it around 10 minutes if you can. Thank you.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. A kind mention about my book, but my wife says don't count the unhatched chickens yet. And I have many friends in this institute. It was a nice place to come back. But the late Mike Mussa developed his international economics following Mandel Fleming type of analysis. And I somehow differ opinions about balance of payments and so forth with John Williamson and Fred Bergsten about the currency war. It seems. Still, it is very pleasant place to visit and discuss about practical policy matters, but incorporating our theoretical wisdom. And I had a very nice fortune when I was proofreading my recent book. Mr. Abe called me. I was stunned and I couldn't answer systematically, so I wrote some memo to him and he used it for the campaign. And my friends said I was looking for the years to put my opinion in, but now many people are getting their ideas into my ears. And I was interested in the role of ideas and political leadership, or political specific interests in determining the right or sometimes wrong economic policy, like the wrong monetary policy of Japan in the past 15 years. And as an academic, I would like to sell academic part. Ideas is important, and good understanding is most crucial. But this event showed me that unless there is some wise political leadership, even good ideas cannot be utilized. By the way, Abenomics was named by Mr. Hidenao Nakagawa, LDP's secretary of the first Abe cabinet. But I was pleased to find that by many advisors like Kikuo Iwata, Kozo Yamamoto, congressman, Yoichi Takahashi, and Etsuro Honda, and others, Mr. Abe finally convinced that monetary policy is one of the most important venues for recovering the Japanese economy. And I think Professor Ito will talk about these more precisely, but usually people say it's very courageous monetary policy and expedient fiscal expenditures and efficient growth strategies. Those are the three arrows to recover the Japanese economy. Printing money cannot forever increase wealth. It helps very much in the process when wages and prices are sluggish. But in the third stage, we have to increase our productivity to enlarge the pie. And the first one is taken very effectively, it seems. So I tell those who argues, according to the old doctrine of the Bank of Japan, that monetary policy cannot work. that the proof of the pudding is the eating, and not so many arguments that monetary policy doesn't work, was disproved by the present surge of stock price as well as the weakening of the yen. Just 1 year and 1 day ago, that was Valentine in Tokyo. Anyway, Valentine Day, the BOJ itself took rather ambitious monetary policy, and the markets reacted very well. But then BOJ took a policy of discounting the effect of this new economic policy. So the policies stopped to encourage the economy. And that is well understood by this Mr. Abe's move in his start of the campaign, that credible monetary policy is important. If BOJ chief discredits the effect of monetary policy himself, then that kind of monetary policy doesn't work. Probably it is worth mentioning that there is some division of opinions in the relationship between the first monetary policy. I am a good student of Mandel, and I think under the flexible rate, the first arrow is more important. But when I interview many American economists too, that if the interest rate is close to zero, then at some point maybe another push of fiscal expenditures, that kind of stimulus may be needed. And in the meeting surrounding the Prime Minister, Mr. Ito, Professor Ito was leaning towards a little bit to this second view. But that, my view is first try the first part, monetary policy and exchange rate effect as much as possible, and after the interest rate doesn't move, there are other channels, Tobin effect or credit acceleration effect. But fiscal policy or some other push may be necessary to recover the long ailing Japanese economy. But sometimes we have to be careful that the second part is used by the old-timey politicians or old-timey Keynesians, that whipping the economy by fiscal expenditure is the only way to recover the economy. And that, I don't think that's true. And if that path is taken, the serious, I think also serious, government debt situation will not be cured by this active monetary policy. And structural reform is very important in any type of economy, and particularly in Japan, where still government regulations are excessive, in my opinion. I think I will just show you some of the pictures of Japanese economy and monetary policy. If we normalize by unity the pre-Lehman crisis hyper money or balance sheets magnitude, then British Bank of England, FRB all increased drastically after the shock. Japanese economy was not damaged very much by financial troubles. That was a good thing. That is probably the only thing that Mr. Shirakawa should be commended. But it didn't increase. And yesterday's in Financial Times, Bank of Japan likes the other picture to look at the actual amount of money, or this balance sheet balance, and that looks quite different. And because I carry $100 in here, then my wife says it's sometimes dangerous to be stolen. But in Japan, when we are going to some evening dinner with 200 cash and so forth, I may not feel very secure. The way money is used is quite different in cash-oriented society and check-oriented society. So sometimes Bank of Japan use this kind of thing as a rhetoric that Bank of Japan is expanding money from the beginning. But what matters is, as you see, the rate of increase and real exchange rate soared in Japan. I think it's coming down, fortunately, by Abenomics. And this great dip of industrial production or sort of monthly GDP surrogate shows very deep down after the Lehman shock because of the inaction of the Bank of Japan and high rate of exchange rates. Japan suffered relatively. This is relative to the economic scale. So probably US suffered equally in magnitude, but in relative scale, Japan had the worst relative income loss or production. And you see that another dip is naturally because of the earthquake, unfortunate earthquake. And inflation rate and so forth. I didn't prepare the slides, but one thing I'd like to finish this speech is about the currency war. And Japanese defense against the criticism is that Japan stood very silent when the great surge of other countries and surge of real exchange rate hike of the yen. So why Japan should be blamed if we do relaxing monetary policy? But I worked in this field very much, and probably my local fame in academics is given by this international monetary independence. And under the fixed rate, I worked the doctrine that monetary coordination is necessary and useful. But by the same analytical scheme, we can prove, contrary to my first propositions and so monetary policy should be assigned to its own price level, not exchange rate, but the price level and unemployment. And then the world will be led to a kind of better state. So if Brazilian ministers complain of currency war, Brazil itself should take its proper monetary policy. The monetary policy of one country is assigned to its own country and not for others. If we assign our monetary policy to American state of affairs, then really the flexible exchange rate will collapse into the beggar thy neighbor malaise. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Hamada Sensei. It's a great honor and pleasure to be following on you. I'm going to cover, in a sense, much of the same ground, and I hope that's not too repetitive. But I think it's important to pick up on two critical points that, among the many that Professor Hamada made. Point one is that mainstream macroeconomics believes that the Bank of Japan didn't do anything for the last couple decades, no matter how much 2 out of the 3 past governors said. And so therefore, we should be hopeful that a new approach to monetary policy will have actual impact. Point two, which again, I'm picking up on Professor Hamada, but I completely agree, Japan is still growing below potential. It was arguably growing at or slightly above potential in the mid-2000s, but has since regressed. And that potential remains much higher than many people think. And therefore, it is entirely right for Abenomics to set a goal of getting growth up very strongly over the next couple of years, even though there are, of course, many structural issues to be dealt with in the long term. Now, let me expand on each of those points with a couple of side remarks on fiscal policy and exchange rate effects. Most importantly, on monetary policy. Koichi cited our late colleague, Mike Musa, who, of course, in addition to being brilliant, was the master of the quip. And he at one point had said, putting Alan Greenspan in charge of bank supervision was like putting a conscientious objector in charge of the Marine Corps. Governor Shirakawa or Governor Hayami, as head of an expansionary monetary policy, is the same thing. They both took office and insisted that they could not do anything, and that any attempts they made would fail, and that when they made attempts that they weren't, heart wasn't in it and was contrary to their principles, and it would only prove that their attempts would fail. Now, monetary policy is not merely a confidence game, but this meant that at every level throughout the BOJ, and every time there was innovation, please shut that off. Every time there was an innovation or an attempt at new policy, the governors themselves were undercutting it. And there is a very simple way, in addition to what the chart that Professor Hamada rightly puts up, that there was no monetary policy reaction to the downturn since 2008 on the part of the BOJ, except for this very brief thing since Valentine's Day a year ago, which I'll discuss. The key thing is you want to not just talk, you want to do. This is true whether it's the Bank of Japan, the Bank of England where I served, the Federal Reserve. I said this at the Jackson Hole last summer. It's not enough to merely say you're going to do something. You have to actually do something. And in monetary policy, when interest rates are at zero, the way you actually do something is you buy assets. And the assets you buy, the bigger, the impact is bigger, the less those assets look like cash. And as has been repeatedly established, including by the Japanese economist Kazuo Ueda and many people since, the Bank of Japan has chosen repeatedly in its so-called quantitative easing to only buy JGBs of shorter than 3-year duration and short bills. And the new innovation of the supposedly great new policy last February was to buy bills, effectively 6 months. This is cash. You would not expect it to have any real significant impact on the economy. So there is just a simple fact that truly expansionary monetary policy in Japan under the guise of quantitative easing has not yet been tried, full stop. Perhaps thanks to the two professors we have with us today, perhaps thanks to some things I and others have said, all of the candidates to become, all of the leading candidates to become the next governor of the Bank of Japan and the statements of the Abe administration make it clear that this will change. That they will buy longer duration JGBs and they will consider buying other yen-denominated assets. I believe strongly this will make a material difference to the outcomes for Japan when this starts. I am hoping that they don't do it incrementally by doing 5 years, then 7 years, then 10 years. There's no reason they can't, at the April meeting, immediately start buying 10-year JGBs and out. If they want to do more and constrain the balance sheet, it would be perfectly reasonable for them to sell their accumulated short bonds and bills or let them expire and just replace them with 10 years. That would be, in fact, Operation Twist, in a sense. Just as the Fed did, it would give an additional boost to markets. This is all very easily doable by the Bank of Japan. They have the facilities in place, they have the operational expertise, they have the markets. It would require nothing but the will to do it. And I am quite hopeful that the will to do it will be there. And again, as a matter of forecasting, because people have gotten so inured in Japan and in the JGB market to the idea that the Bank of Japan interventions have no meaningful effect, they, I think, will be surprised on the upside by how much this matters when it takes place. The yield curve is very low, but in proportional terms, as for example my colleague David Miles at the Bank of England used to say, what matters isn't the absolute level. If you move down the yield curve by 20% at the long end, that's a very large effect, even if it's only a few basis points. And monetary policy is always transmitted through this cascade of relative asset prices. Even if you're cutting interest rates, you don't control all the interest rates in the economy. You're hoping for this cascade of decisions out to private actors. I think it would be quite reasonable for the Bank of Japan to be ready to buy domestically denominated corporate bonds, in particular bank bonds. They've already talked about this, some of the candidates. The facility is already in place. It would be constructive. It could add extra power to what they're doing, as well as helping the banking system when they're pulling duration out of the market in JGBs. I'm getting a little technical here, but I want to get this on the record. The key challenge for economic policy in Japan, in fact for all of us in the developed, so-called developed world, is how do you get private investors' money off the sidelines? In Japan, it seems particularly obvious that there's a huge amount of money sitting on corporate balance sheets after all the repayments of the past decade not being invested, but that, of course, is the case here in the US also, where you have very cash-rich companies. That is where fiscal policy, as well as creating a more inflationary environment, not a hugely inflationary environment, simply a non-deflationary environment, comes in. And there is the point where I differ slightly from where Abenomics is, although I think largely I'm in line with where Professor Hamada was. Some of you may have noticed my friend and hero Paul Krugman and I disagreed slightly lately on Japanese fiscal policy. I don't want to make a big thing of this. The issue for me is, as long as the Abe administration has committed to raising the consumption tax significantly in 2014 and 2015, which they have done, jerking the economy around by doing a little bit more stimulus this year only to take it away next year, I think is a not great idea. I think the net costs and benefits are not very good. That said, if you use the fiscal stimulus as a structural reform effort, so you treat the consumption tax increases as permanent, which they will be in all likelihood, but you create a temporary tax incentive, say, for investment tax credits, which I know the Abe team has spoken about, but I also know is not really currently in the budget proposals as strongly as at least I would like. If you did accelerated depreciation, if you did all these things that we're well familiar with that we have on the shelf that you could do, and thereby permanently shift the balance of consumption taxation versus investment taxation or corporate taxation in Japan, that would be worthwhile. You could even, if you were feeling sufficiently radical, make some of those changes permanent and promise to keep raising the consumption tax further out. Keep it neutral. Stephan Danninger from the IMF is an expert in these things and can talk more about the broad issues. This is not, I want to note, because I think Japan is about to hit the wall. As I said in my FT article, some of you saw a few weeks ago, as Christian Broda and David Weinstein did in an excellent paper some 7 or 8 years ago, Japan's debt problem is misleading, even if you look at public debt problem, that is, even if you look at the overall net rather than gross situation. But it is costly. There's a difference between it is an immediate disaster, which is not, and it is a poor use of resources and distortionary, which it is. And that, to me, is the difference between when I and many others were advocating fiscal stimulus in 97 or 2000 versus now, is the debt situation is having bigger costs now. So you want to balance this out. But that doesn't mean it's a disaster, and it doesn't mean that you have to forswear all changes in the tax code. Now, I'm almost out of time, so let me just make 2 more points quickly. First, in terms of what's likely to happen, I do worry that if the fiscal package as currently seems to be proposed consists of the traditional types of public works spending, it will have very low multiplier, very low impact, not because it's so inherently bad, although there is that issue, but because there's so few shovel-ready projects left to go in Japan. And it would make much more sense to do it through the tax code. I also worry, as several people have raised, that if wages are not raised in the private sector, or at least kept up in the private sector heading into the wage round in April, that the offset from what I expect will be increased inflation, lower exchange rate on people's wages will put a downward pressure on the economy. So I can be quite confident about the monetary impact without being quite as confident about the immediate growth impact, and I worry about that. And so I do hope, as the company Lawson's chairman has just announced and some other Japanese companies have announced, they're going to make real wage gains for some Japanese workers given the additional profits of the exchange rate. Finally, the exchange rate. Koichi mentioned our colleagues, Fred Bergson, John Williamson, and others who've spoken about the exchange rate here, and particularly the yen-dollar, many times through the years. As Mark Noland and I both have demonstrated, there is a variety of views on these issues within the Institute. Not all of us are in the same place on this. And right now, we have Bill Klein and John Williamson are doing their next round of estimates on the equilibrium exchange rates. And while I won't scoop them, my guess is that they will find that the yen is probably slightly undervalued by their mark. We have Joe Gagnon, who will be releasing a new study on the econometrics looking at the impact of currency manipulation in a few weeks. We'll all be invited to that event. And of course, his focus is on behavior, not on the level. And his focus, I think rightly, when you look at Japan, is they have not actually manipulated or intervened in foreign currency markets as yet. I think there was a lot of chatter going into the G7 meeting, but I think we have a positive outcome coming out. My personal views are similar to those of Joe Gagnon's in that what matters is, are you actively manipulating the currency? In the same spirit as what I said about monetary policy, what matters is what you do. And Japan's government and the BOJ have not done anything to violate the G20 compact. Now, there have been some excessive statements. It's a young government, as our colleague from Sasakawa Peace Foundation, both here and in Japan, said. Abenomics is a baby. I am convinced that at least the top leadership in Japan understands that unfortunate in-your-face statements about the level of the yen will be counterproductive. I am fully confident that they will not be intervening directly into currency markets, barring some very strange incident and support from their multilateral partners. And within that, monetary policy will succeed. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me. Thank you for having me on this very distinguished panel. I'll speak about 10 minutes, and I'll use a handout that is available, so I referred to it on and off during my presentation. But maybe before I start out about the prospects of Abenomics, I just recently was in Japan, and somebody made a nice, interesting remark saying that in Japan, big reforms happen in 15-year intervals. I guess others have heard that too. The arrival of the black ships in 1854 was 15 years later, followed by the Meiji Revolution, the peace treaty after World War II, 1952, followed with 1968, the Japan-US Security Treaty. And if you look at the economics of the post-bubble era, 1998 seems to be the trough. Asian crisis, financial sector crisis within Japan, so it led to the lowest, what we estimate, potential growth rate. So now we're 15 years later, and maybe Abenomics has that magic touch. What about the Abenomics that we like? Certainly we share the goals. Feeding deflation should be a top priority, as well as raising growth. Aging is, Japan is the country with the most prominent aging problem. Also the comprehensive approach, I think, is something that is important. If you look at my second slide, I just wanted to highlight comprehensive is really important. There are multiple challenges. Low growth and lingering deflation is the two cornerstones that I've mentioned the most, but it's really for us the large fiscal deficit and the high debt that needs to be addressed through these reforms. If you turn one more page, you see a chart that outlines the contours of a comprehensive reform package, which in many ways looks similar to 3 arrows, except for there are many more arrows. But I think on 2 parts or a split between the left and the right side is pretty obvious. On the left side, all these green parts referring to a growth strategy. And we think raising growth is sort of like the essential long-term ingredient in order to get out of deflation and in order to get the debt level down. That needs to be complemented by the 2 arrows, which I think are now very actively in play: monetary policy and fiscal policy. I call it sound macro policies. I'll talk a little bit in the remaining a few minutes about these 2 aspects, but mostly about the fiscal policy, which I think in the government's prescription is called as flexible fiscal policy. I would like to call it the credible fiscal strategy. Before I get into the later one, let me talk and echo what Adam was saying about monetary policy. If you look at slide below, you see the easing activity by the Bank of Japan since it introduced its asset purchase program. It's increased quite rapidly, but the two biggest elements of it are purchases indeed of JGBs with 3 years maturity and less, and financing bills which are even shorter maturity. So options to make monetary policy more effective is indeed going into longer maturities. There may also be options to link the duration of purchases to achieving inflation. I think with a very, very flat yield curve, you need to influence expectations, and you do so by giving guidance, forward guidance, on how long you'll be carrying out purchases. Part that should also be considered is going into risky assets. I think you mentioned bonds, but I think equities is another deep market that could be touched. That is very unusual for central banks, but these are unusual times. You would like to both address low growth as well as deflation, and sending a strong signal in that direction may also be an option that the Bank of Japan could consider. So this is as much as I'd like to say about monetary easing, but let me get into sort of like the main point on a credible fiscal strategy. So far, the government has committed or reiterated its commitments to the G20, which are reducing the primary balance in half from its 2010 level. This would bring primary balance down to minus 3.4%. Currently projected in, we projected the primary deficit at 8.8%, so that's a large first step. But then in order to bring the debt ratio down, you need to get into a primary surplus, and that goal has been set for 2020. What is missing is sort of like how you get there. And I think having a credible strategy is incredibly important to make short-term measures such as the current stimulus that is in place or monetary policy effective. And I tell you why in the next few slides, why it is so important to have a credible strategy. And I have 3 risks, fiscal risks outlined. The first one is given the high level of debt, even a small 100 basis points increase in yields has a substantial impact on the debt ratio. We have done some simulations, and you can see that the debt ratio, this is net public debt, can go up in a matter of 10 to 20 years by another, my eyes getting old, 30 to 50% of GDP. So that's obviously makes it more difficult to bring that down. The second risk is, while people say Japan has a very stable domestic investor base, and that's true, that is held domestically, held by institutional investors, but part of the investors are banks, and banks would suffer from an increase in interest rates through the valuation losses of their bonds. Estimates by the Bank of Japan are on page 5, and you can see that at least for regional banks, these are the smaller banks, the impact on tier capital from a 100 basis points increase in interest rates would be quite substantial. So that's sort of the risk number 2. And I think the risk number 3 is the interaction between stimulus that aims to sort of like jumpstart the economy, and at the same time a monetary policy that needs to pursue achieving a 2% inflation guide, which means loosening. So you have on page 6 juxtaposed the stimulus, which we estimate in effective terms about being 1.5% 4% of GDP of additional spending that mostly is debt financed. And at the same time, if you start ease more aggressively, it could be perceived, I'm not saying it does, but it could be perceived that there's some monetization happening. And I haven't seen anybody who hasn't seen through this and seems to believe that, but this is sort of just one step that who knows if there's a next stimulus that's needed that needs to be supported. So one needs to be careful and have a plan in place for medium-term fiscal reforms. So let me just make 3 points on concluding with that. So what are the elements of credible fiscal policy? Well, first, actually, there needs to be a firm commitment to the consumption tax rate. It is not yet fully approved. There is a legislation in place, but the government needs to decide on implementation, which we understand will happen in the summer, August or September. Why VAT? And I think that the reasons are amply known, but let me just reiterate it. Japan has the lowest VAT rate among advanced economies. There's a nice chart on page 7, but overall revenue ratio, that is the yield in percent of GDP, is also low. So there is room to, this is really sort of like the area where adjustment happens, and obviously VAT, or the consumption tax I should say, is a very efficient way relative to other ways to raise revenue. But what about beyond 2015? And here I've copied our famous menu of options table into my presentation, and I leave it you to read it through. Let me just explain briefly. The left column is what currently is roughly in place. That achieves roughly 4 to 5% of adjustments, only halfway towards that goal of lowering the debt ratio. So what is needed next? And I'll point out 2 things. I think I agree with Adam that option should take seriously is raising the consumption tax further. There's no specific one number that's the right number. But I think there are also important expenditure side reforms. One to point out is longevity and health is tremendously better in Japan than in other countries. So raising the retirement age from 65 to 67, for instance, creates both savings on the for the pension system, but also keeps very productive, very healthy, and very efficient people in the labor force. And as you know, the shrinking labor force is one of the factors drawing down growth. So let me stop with these 2 points and sort of like make sort of like a plea of how does Abenomics stack up. Well, I think it's an ambitious program, but in order to be successful, it needs to be complemented with medium-term policies. It's not that these policies are not on the table, they haven't been announced, so we don't know whether they're going to be effective enough or not. But I think it's important to act very soon to make sure that credible fiscal strategy is in place as soon as possible to make it easier for monetary policy to ease, but as well as a growth strategy to raise growth, which implies sort of a difficult structural reforms, some of which I think we'll discuss in the second panel.
Thank you very much. I'm not sure we actually need the name tags since I don't think any of us look particularly alike.
Me, Mark.
It's about as close as it gets. So we've had 3 very stimulating discussions. We have about 40 minutes. There is a microphone in the center aisle, and there is a roving microphone. So please just raise your hand or go back to the center microphone. Please identify yourself when you ask a question, and if possible, indicate to whom on the panel it is addressed. So, any questions? Arthur Alexander.
Yeah, Arthur Alexander at Georgetown. I have a question for Professor Hamada and perhaps Professor Ito. One of the curious things is how Mr. Abe came out of the gates running. He was ready. And I'm curious about what you might know about his kind of years in the wilderness where he was not prime minister, coming out with a leadership style very different from previous 5 or 6 prime ministers, and very different from his own previous behavior, where he actually is showing leadership with ideas, with strategies, approaches, and so on. Very different from everybody since Mr. Koizumi some years ago. I'm curious as whether you have any ideas about where did this all come from?
And I thought I was about to ask a politically sensitive question.
Actually, I am also curious about same problem. Mr. Abe have been very understanding that monetary policy or monetary stimulus is necessary ingredient, important ingredient of recovery. And when I saw him at various intervals, he was supportive to the idea, but he was not really convinced, like the president, that that first arrow will start the Japanese economy. Last June last year, I'm doing research on the determinants of economic policy, and I asked him in an interview several questions, and at that time he was convinced that the present type of Abenomics is necessary and useful. So in between the 1 year, I met before last June. He must have been convinced by other advisors, or he also mentioned that he was at the turn of Bank of Japan policy, like the abolishment, stopping of the zero interest rate in 2000 and so forth. And recent 2006, Mr. Fukui reneged his promise to keep monetary policy enough expansive. And he told me that, Mr. Abe told me, he was thinking of the possibility of that Bank of Japan view was wrong, but he was convinced by that kind of incident.
Yes, sir.
Thanks. Andrew Hodge, U.S. Government. This is a question both for Adam and Stephen. You both suggested, obviously, there's a vulnerability to high levels of Japanese government debt. Adam, I guess, in particular, in your Financial Times article. It strikes me, however, that maybe, I mean, looking at history, the main vulnerability of debtors, or who pulls the plug, is related to total debt or foreign debt. And actually, on both those two scores, if you're looking at total debt or foreign debt, Japan actually ranks fairly well, with a lot of the debt problem being the government debt. So, in particular, for example, Stephen cited a number where Japan gets in trouble over 20 years or so on because of excessive interest burden or interest service in the government debt. On the other hand, in the U.S., net interest on total debt is right now 11% of GDP. If U.S. interest doubled, that would be a fairly significant shock to the income share and GDP. So I wonder if you can talk about whether Japan's relatively good scores on total debt and foreign debt imply maybe a more room potentially on the fiscal side.
Thanks. I'll go first since Stephan just went. I have to take issue with that number about 11% of GDP to me sounds wrong. If we've got 90% debt level and we're paying 2% interest on most of it, that doesn't get you to 11% of GDP. Total net. Anyway, that's not a meaningful concept. So we're working on the fiscal side. I think you're right that Japan has room, and I think that's why both Stephan and arguably the IMF and I and a bunch of other people have said we don't expect it to blow up. We're not worried about the yield curve suddenly spiking for largely the reasons you said. The net debt level is much lower than the gross debt. A lot of the holdings are by somewhat degree captured savers and captured institutions, and there's very little foreign debt, and most of the foreign debt is held by central banks or other official institutions. So on all those grounds, that's why you have room. However, I want to strongly agree with the first two of the three costs that Stephan had in his very nice presentation. Number one being that simply the running cost of rolling that over if the interest rates go up is very high. And that's what I tried to refer to, perhaps unclearly, in my FT article and subsequent statements, is that's what I mean by crowding out. That realistically, Japanese public spending isn't going to go up from where it is on a steady state basis, and private investment needs to go up. And if a big chunk of money is going to just straight out interest payments, it crowds out public investment and other public spending. So it is a bad distortion, it is a cost, even though it doesn't mean they couldn't do it. And then the second point that Stephan raised, which is the vulnerability of the banking system, particularly some of the smaller banks, our former colleague Carmen Reinhardt, among others, and people in this building as well, have pointed out about the issue of financial repression. That when, as we've seen very much in Europe, we talk about the negative cycle between sovereigns and banks holding sovereign debt. And so the issue in Japan is not that you're going to have some Greek-like crisis, but that you are effectively engaged in financial repression by forcing all this public debt into these banks, and so that they don't want to do anything else. That has a cost to productivity, a cost to investment, and leaves these banks vulnerable in the same sense, although to a much lesser degree, that we've been worrying about the European banks. And that's why I personally think it would not be a bad idea to combine longer duration JGB purchases with some purchases of Japanese bank debt. Stephan?
Thank you. Maybe not that much to add. One point that's maybe different in Japan than in other countries is that the adjustment time that is projected to bring that down is very, very long. So we're talking about 10 years, maybe after the stimulus, we might need to think a little bit even longer to get that down on a downward path. So during this time period, this 100 basis point increase, for example, that was shown as an example, that can sort of act like it's quite as a brake. So it may not sort of derail the economy in sort of putting it into a debt crisis, but it makes it so much harder to bring that down and put so much more onus on raising growth, finding reforms that can increase growth, and also to bring sort of like investment back.
So I would like to, before turning to John Williamson, I would like to apologize to my colleague to the left. I think there's something wrong when the IMF is to my left, but it is Stephan Danninger. I am particularly sensitive to this since I frequently work with Stephen Haggard, who often has his name mispronounced. So John Williamson, then John Lipsky.
Thank you very much. The question is directed, I suppose, mainly to Koichi Hamada, but it maybe would apply to the other speakers as well. It's about the difference you declared with the debt, the balance of payments and real exchange rate objectives of myself and Bergson, Fred Bergson, and also Bill Klein was mentioned. The base of our estimate of overvaluation is whether, or undervaluation, is whether a country has a current account deficit greater than 3%. So presumably you are envisaging there's logically there are two possible bases on which you could have a difference with us. One is if you disagree with the type of model we use to translate translate exchange rates into current account surpluses, which let me assume it's not that, and in fact that you are differing instead on the current account surpluses, and whether you should worry about those if they are offset by a capital outflow on the private account. That I think would be the alternative Joe Canyon view, that really there's nothing to worry about as long as the current account surplus is offset by an outflow on private capital account. If that is in fact the basis of your difference, then you know the logical implication is that you would favor or you would react with equanimity if there were a current account surplus of 5%, provided it was offset by a capital outflow. And you know, that may be fine for Japan. It's not clear that it's fine for the rest of the world.
Do you want to say
Thank you pointing out some of my opinion, difference to his and so forth. I think if we take the whole world economy, sometimes a country can be a capital exporter, another time capital importer. If the population is expected to be declining, then it would be natural for a nation to build more asset by having current account surplus. And later on, probably, very aged country had to live on accumulated assets and having current account deficit. And last time I was invited by John here, I read the paper how the rate of time preference affect the long run state of current account balance. If a country is more patient and take care of elderlies more, I don't say it's good or not, then that kind of country can accumulate current account surplus for some time. And therefore, there is no norm. It's not a norm that current account should be equalized to zero. If you enforce by monetary measures like the Plaza Accord, then it will create a lot of problems later. So my point is that more patient country may accumulate some current account surpluses and so forth. And monetary policy and exchange rate should be governed in order to have reasonable price stability and employment level. That's maybe a little out of the standard textbook version.
Let me, just for the sake of diversity of institute views, give a quick answer that is not set in what John believes is the limits of what's a logical, acceptable response. My issue with the fundamental equilibrium exchange rates argument, even though it is a very valuable tool for us to do, and we will be proudly rolling out the next iteration in time for the Spring Fund Bank meetings, is that it is neither an achievable policy objective nor an attractor in markets. The whole point of the exercise seems to be pointing out that you have divergences from these fears for long periods. And so neither markets nor governments successfully drive you back to these fears. So the question is, how useful is it to then try to frame policy recommendations or judgments based on them? Now you can say, based on the very transparent and consistent set of assumptions that John and Bill and others who've worked on this have, that, okay, this tells you where you are. But for me, I think it misses a lot of both context, in that it matters a lot more when countries are manipulating their exchange rates and running trade surpluses during a global recession than averaging it over moderate fluctuations of the cycle. Then you really are stealing people's lunch. And it matters a lot more in policy terms, the actions, than the levels. Now, none of this disagrees with the fundamental insight John had, in my opinion, which is Keynes and everyone pointed out we didn't have a way of sanctioning surplus countries in the Bretton Woods system, and we need some way of doing that, and here's one way of thinking about it, which I think was very big contribution. But moving forward, in my personal opinion, and only my personal opinion, I think the idea of speaking about what is an acceptable form of behavior rather than judging what's an acceptable form of exchange rate level is more likely to prove good, just as we did in the trade arena and just as we do in the national security arena.
John Lipsky, Johns Hopkins SAIS. This is two quick questions inspired by Adam's remark regarding financial repression. One is, first of all, as we all know, nominal long-term interest rates in Japan remain very low. What is the basis for your optimism that that monetary expansion will have a substantial impact or significant impact on economic activity? But secondly, the most politically successful prime ministerial figure of recent times was Prime Minister Koizumi. And we recall that his second election was centered entirely around the notion that privatization of the postal savings system was the critical element in achieving structural reform in the Japanese economy. He won overwhelming support, but he was followed by Prime Minister Abe in his first term, who effectively abandoned that goal under various pressures. Was the Koizumi analysis wrong, that postal savings privatization was a critical element in structural reform for Japan? Or is that a missing element of importance in the current set of policy proposals? Thank you.
I thank you, John, for the very pointed questions. I have a feeling both my colleagues will want to get on this as well, so I'll give very clipped answers, if Mark will allow. First, on the monetary side, as I tried to express this earlier, I think the effect on nominal variables is likely to be much more significant than the effect on real variables. That said, there is a great deal of monetary history and monetary theory that suggests that you do get trapped in certain sets of expectation regimes and monetary regimes. The Japanese situation, as I think Professor Hamada has pointed out, among many others, has really been trapped in a deflation-encouraging monetary regime. And so getting out of that regime will make a material difference. But I do admit that it is that, just as I found with QE at the Bank of England, the Fed finds your direct mapping from positive monetary actions, even if you can get to the asset prices, the exchange rates, doesn't necessarily get you on net a huge bang on the real side, and that's why I want to be a little careful. Just quickly on the postal savings privatization. I agree. I mean, structural reform in the financial sector is very important in Japan. I think, we've all got our laundry lists. I think former Prime Minister Koizumi, former Minister Takanaka were entirely right to target postal savings as one good way to do it. It's neither necessary nor sufficient, but I think it does point to the fact that you do have to make change there as well.
Maybe stepping into the growth aspect of your question about financial sector repression. True that low interest rates narrows net interest margins and makes banks less profitable and less willing to take risks. At the same time, businesses that are not viable can survive, and you can have evergreening for some time, and that suppresses innovation and activity, especially in the small, medium-sized sector. This, on top of it, I think this sluggishness is on top of it enhanced by government support measures, which have been in place for some time, and I'm talking about the credit guarantee schemes that allow banks get up to 100%. Now it's about to expire this emergency measure and come down to 80%, but it gets them to rely on the government to take on some of the risk. And I think measures like these that have been sort of meant to be sort of like painkillers during the very deep recession after the Lehman shock are now turning into sleeping pills. So like the blanket the innovation and the cover-ups of initiatives. And I think maybe part of the Abenomics, the third part, the growth strategy, should be a rethinking on how do we get risk capital into the private sector. This involves the banks. They need to have proper credit information. This involves SMEs that may not be able to rely as much on these credit guarantees. Yes, and maybe at some point you get some growth despite this low interest rate environment.
Like Janet Yellen of the Federal Reserve, we are taught by James Tobin and Brenner type of general equilibrium approach to asset market. And if you use sufficient different weapons, not just short-term GB, but variety of government bond and also other assets, the Tobin Q effect will work, and it is already demonstrated by some scientific work that Tobin Q worked under the regime of quantity easing in Japan. And also Bernanke related credit channel, acceleration of credit channel would work if we have higher stock market values and so on. Many people worry about the reduction of bond values or asset values, but they don't count the other effect that equity market will be invigorized. For the second question, I'd like to shift to Professor Ito about
He's right there, Michael. The second question.
Why don't we just move on to Matthew Goodman, who's been waiting patiently.
Okay. Thank you, Marcus. Matthew Goodman of CSIS. Interesting discussion. Since this is billed as a pre-summit assessment, if you were drafting talking points for President Obama to use with Prime Minister Abe, and you wanted to say the following four things, in what order would you order these four things? And would you agree these are the right four things to say? A, keep it up on the stimulus arrows of Abenomics. B, be careful about the exchange rate. C, be careful about debt. And D, get started on the growth strategy, on structural reform.
Well, if I'm allowed, since I've actually not directly been in that position, but sort of close to it. I would have a slightly different four in a different order. One, A, you got the message not to let your people talk about the exchange rate that way, right? That's A. B, keep it up with the stimulus. Domestic monetary policy is good, as our Treasury already said, go for it. C, join TPP, as we're about to talk about in the next panel. You need it for structural reform, you need it for national security, we need you in there, let's get that done. D, here's some nice natural gas we can sell you. Those would be my four talking points. Obviously, the national security talking points, in which Marcus and several people from Sasakawa can talk better than I can, what might dominate, but that would be my order of economic talking points.
Steve Beckman.
Steve Beckman. I know that the title of this session is Abenomics, and I'm just struck by how incredibly narrowly focused the presentations have been and the discussion has been. I worked for the electrical workers and the auto workers for 30 years, so I've been involved in discussions of Japanese economic policy for all of that time. And the presumption seems to be that economic policy in Japan works sort of like the way it does in the United States, and the kind of measures that are adopted are in an institutional structure that's kind of like ours and everybody else's in the West. And the reality is obviously quite different. The institutional structure in Japan is very different. Adam says you judge exchange rate issues by what they do rather than what they say. I've watched exchange rate changes between the United States and Japan for a long time, and it's very hard to identify the specific actions that affect exchange rates, but somehow the exchange rate seems to go in the direction that would be in the interest of Japan's institutional structural growth model. And that's the issue that I really want to...
I'm sorry, just to interrupt. What do you think happened to the yen until 6 months ago over the past 3 years? And how was that in the interest of Japan's structural growth model? How is
it wasn't in the interest of Japan's structural growth model, and there must be a political debate within Japan that has some influence over this policy, and I think the United States pressing may have had something to do with Japan's exchange rate policy, and there are certainly other economic factors that influence Japan's decisions in this area. But it seems to me that what you're proposing is that an export-led growth strategy is what Japan ought to be pursuing. And there's been no discussion of where the investment might go if investment in Japan grows, what industries would be the focus of that investment. The tradition is it goes to the big companies that are big exporters. What in the way you've presented Abenomics changes that dynamic and creates different opportunities? And what are the political pressures within Japan that are pushing for reforms of the institutions and changes in the structural distribution of income? Aren't these issues that need to be discussed in economic policy? Certainly in the United States, the political dynamics of who benefits and who doesn't from economic growth is a huge issue, and yet no one has talked about that at all. Thank you.
Maybe I can just add to what has been left out, because we have a second session on this, is a detailed discussion of what should be on top of the growth strategy. I think TPP we have supported for some time, that has distributional but also has very powerful growth implications. One aspect of TPP that may be overlooked is that it might require an opening up of domestic markets, so bringing investment in and creating a catalyst for domestic reforms. That's one aspect. Another aspect that's extremely important is tapping into available labor sources or employment for underutilized groups. And we had a very nice paper a colleague of mine wrote on Can Women Save Japan? The labor force participation rate of women is significantly lower than in other G7 economies. And there are both structural barriers, there are cultural barriers, but there are also legislative, meaning fiscal barriers, disincentives, for example, for dual household earners. So this can be addressed. This has powerful effects on growth. We made some estimates. It could raise growth over a 10-year period by 0.25%. That doesn't seem a lot, but if potential growth is estimated at 1%, it's not such a small amount. Another item was what I referred to as the breaking up of this small and business size sector. These are businesses that serve the domestic economy. So it's not necessarily, we're talking about an export-led recovery. One has to remind oneself that only 15% of GDP is exports in Japan. So there's a large domestic economy that needs to be revived, and I think that's a more difficult task, a more complex task with many elements that we'll discuss in the second panel.
Yeah, just to pick up on that just very briefly. There is a second panel. It's focusing primarily on TPP. As market economists, most of us believe that if you have forced trade integration and you at a high quality level, and you have a growing economy which doesn't have the distortions of deflation, many of the other issues that were raised will be addressed, or at least it will be more conducive to addressing those. Certainly, 15 years of stagnation has not seemed to generate structural reform. I do just want to personally align myself with the idea that Japan can solve many of its demographic problems by getting over its institutionalized sexism and making use of their highly educated female workforce. And though I forget the author's name, I do commend to you the paper by Stephan's colleague.
Chad Steinberg.
Thank you.
Hi, thank you. I'm Ben Hancock. I'm a reporter for Inside U.S. Trade here in town. I had a question for Dr. Hamada and also Dr. Posen as well, if you'd like to follow up. Dr. Hamada, following up on monetary policy and its relationship to currency exchange rates, you made a remark about Brazil, that if they're going to complain about a currency war, then they ought to take their own steps. I wondered if you could elaborate on what you meant by that, and also just talk a little bit about whether you agree that these steps and measures that you're proposing are not indeed intended to manipulate the currency, but that's really a side effect. And then also, Dr. Posen, if you wanted to follow up on this, I know we're going to talk about TPP more in the next panel, but there have been proposals by Sherrod Brown, for example, to put disciplines on currency policy and exchange rates. What do you think about those proposals? Would those limit really the ability to take the kind of necessary actions that you all are talking about right now? Thank you.
Thank you. The Greek situation exemplifies that if you cannot aim any flexible exchange rate, then all the adjustment comes on other policies, particularly fiscal policy. So Japan is under flexible exchange rate. And as long as Japan is trying to aim its own domestic goal of a certain price level, unemployment level, and so forth, that will result to some particular exchange level. I don't think it is a manipulation. Japan actually did not, in fact, adjust to the Lehman shock by expanding money supply. And now Japan is trying to recover that kind of flexibility in policies. And our ministers are saying that we did not complain to Bank of England or Federal Reserve when US tried to cope with the Lehman shock by expansive monetary policy. So they say we are not to be criticized for taking aggressive monetary policy. If currency war really happens, if you aim different, two countries aims different level of exchange rate, that is a conflict. But as long as the modern international finance theory tells, and the flexible exchange rate, as long as you aim for the proper domestic economic level and price inflation level, then there would not be serious conflict under the flexible exchange rate. So it's a myth, the word currency war.
You got it.
Maybe I can just reiterate what the IMF has said, I think yesterday in a press briefing by our external relations department, that in general we think that the current talk of currency wars is overblown. While it's true that we've seen the euro strengthen and the yen depreciate, this is the result of better policies and a notable reduction of risks in Europe and more easing in Japan. Overall, these developments are welcome, and there is really no evidence that we can point to that countries are targeting exchange rate or manipulating them. Rather, there is an adoption of policies, domestic policies that are appropriate to their circumstances. We have our own multilateral exchange rate assessment, and our preliminary reassessment says that there are no significant deviations from fair value assessments for the relevant currencies. So that said, we're obviously monitoring these developments, and with an eye on cooperative approach if necessary, and if the IMF is asked, would do its part if needed to be part of this cooperation.
Just to add, I think the statement from the IMF, as you know, people in this building are very happy to criticize the IMF when we disagree with our friends there. And in fact, we hosted an event yesterday in which there were heard some very strong criticisms of the IMF on something else. In this case, speaking for myself, I think this statement Stephan just made is entirely reasonable. I just want to plug, rather than address this issue, just plug that we are, of course, doing work. Joe Gagnon, Gary Huffbauer, and others in this building are continuing to look at the issue of legally and policy terms, can you link the trade regime and the exchange rate regime? When we do this event, probably in early April, with Joe Gagnon's new work, we will also be having Gary and some lawyers international law people talking about that issue. It is worthy of consideration and debate whether you can do that or not, and it is understandable that Brazil and others that I would call the mid-majors are sort of in the firing line as currencies adjust, but the simple reality is, in line with what Koichi said, it's no different than it always was. If a country cuts interest rates because it's doing badly, that usually has an exchange rate effect, and usually someone whines about it. The fact that it's taking place under these circumstances is no different as long as it is an appropriate domestic policy.
Okay, we're running up against our closing time, and I know there are a number of people with questions, but I can't leave the bride standing at the aisle, so.
Thank you very much. Mireya Solis from Brookings, and I want to go back to fiscal policy, because it seems to me that a lot really hinges on the quality of the spending decisions. And Chano-san started this panel saying that Prime Minister Abe had learned from his past mistakes. And my question is, what is the level of confidence from the panelists that the LDP has learned from its past mistakes, and it will target differently its fiscal policy to really go for growth projects? And I also would like to point out that we are in an electoral year, and the central priority, political priority of the Abe government seems to be, of course, to secure that upper house majority. So can we expect in this climate that the right spending decisions will be made? Thank you.
I'm really glad you asked that question, because that's been the question that's been in my head for the last hour and a half. If I understood the presentations correctly, at least from Koichi and Adam, I'm not sure if I want to attribute these views to Stephan, that at least on the fiscal component, what Japan needs in the short run is stimulus and in the long run consolidation. And there's this question about the quality of these expenditures. And Adam wants to go to a more tax and less pork barrel oriented fiscal policy. And it seems to me that that is the question that's just been asked, is the question. Is this a political system capable of delivering that outcome? And it's certainly not unique to Japan. I mean, giving someone candy and then taking it away is tough, as anybody living here in Washington knows. So please, I think that's a perfect question to end this session.
Mark said it all beautifully. Koichi?
I don't. We hear that sometimes tunnels break, and the recovery from Tohoku earthquake area is very slow. So there are qualitatively there are many places to make Japan safer and more appropriate to live, and I quite agree in this supplanting auxiliary budget will help to solve those questions. But at the same time, if LDP politicians would like to use this as a good electorate gathering device, then Japan's budget deficit will not end forever. So I think quality rather than its effect of enhancing the economic activity is the most important aim for immediate fiscal policy.
Well, I think you can all agree with me that we have had 3 excellent presentations. I think that they have clearly demonstrated both the importance and the analytical complexity of the issues that Japan is grappling with on the macroeconomic side. And as I think this ending discussion has indicated, it goes beyond the straight textbook economics to some knotty political economy questions as well. So please join me in thanking our panelists. We'll break for coffee.